Okay, let's let's jump into this. Today, this is the second video I've made today. I don't know if I'll publish it today, but today I want to talk about critical grace theory by Trueman, published last year in November. You can find it on the First Things website right here. Critical grace theory by Carl R. Trueman, published November of 2023. I think this is important. I've expressed before that I think critical theory is probably the greatest threat we're facing today as a church, as the West, moreover. And I'm going to explain a little bit why before we actually get into this paper, and explain more as we go along. But let's just start out by reading what Carl Trueman is saying in this first paragraph, and then reading a little bit about what critical theory is, and then I'll comment on it as well, and then we'll go through the rest. I don't know how far I'll get. I'm fairly tired. I've still got jet lag, but I have time, and I'm not feeling motivated to do much else right now other than to respond to these things. So let's do this. First paragraph. This is all a quote. As debates over critical race theory rage on, both in society and within the church, one important point seems to have been missed by all sides. Many of the most important biblical writers were among the sharpest critical theorists of their day. I may be naive to imagine that an appreciation of the theological resources available to those who wish to hone their analysis of society might move the current discussion forward, given that so many presume that race, class, gender, sexual identity, and the rest exhaust our critical tools. But Christians, at least, should acknowledge Isaiah and Paul as more fruitful interlocutors than Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. So that's a statement. That's the general point of his general thesis. The biblical writers were among the most sharpest critical theorists of their day. Isaiah and Paul were better critical theorists than Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw. Okay, let's talk about what critical theory is. He mentions in this, of course, critical race theory. We'll talk about that in a minute. But his central point is about critical theory more broadly as a way of looking at the world, you might say. This idea of it's a critical tool, a way to look at the world, a lens, as was said in Southern Baptist Convention back in 2019. Let's jump over here. This is from New Discourses online, James Lindsay's website. And this is from his Encyclopedia of the Woke. He goes through terminology that you may not understand, that I may not understand, and he tries to explain it. Now, I have my own differences with some of these definitions, but he does a good job of explaining it. And I'll say what he says, and then I'll give you a more Christianized version of what he's saying, a more biblical assessment. Okay, apologies, I had to go and pull up another link that I realized that I didn't have halfway through this paragraph analysis. But let's start with Max Horkheimer's definition of a critical theory. He's more or less the father of critical theory. And so let's just start here with this paragraph. Max Horkheimer defined a critical theory in direct opposition to a traditional theory in a 1937 piece called Traditional and Critical Theory. Now, remember, this is Horkheimer's view as we're talking about this. This isn't necessarily the right way to view it. So whereas a traditional theory is meant to be descriptive of some phenomenon, usually social, and aims to understand how it works and why it works that way, a critical theory should proceed from a perspective, prescriptive, normative, moral vision for society. So let me just stop there for a second. So traditional theory, Horkheimer understands this is how people normally think about the way the world works. They look at the world, they seek to learn from it how it works and why it works that way. It's simply It's simply learning. It's not meant to be transformative. Critical theory, on the other hand, gives a prescriptive, normative, moral vision for society. So in other words, it sets up, this is how society should look. It describes how the item being critiqued fails that vision, usually in a systemic sense. So it's an idea that everything contributes to how society is, and society is built around power dynamics, and we'll talk about that in a second. And it prescribes activism to subvert, dismantle, disrupt, overthrow, or change it. That is, generally, to break and then remake society in accordance with the particular critical theory's prescribed vision. So normally, and these are my words now, right? Let's take the idea of a traditional theory. I'll call it classical theory. In a classical theory, you're looking at the world and you're seeing how it works and why. You're learning about mistakes from the past, from history. You're learning about why this economic system didn't work and why this economic system has worked. And you're learning all of these things and you're going, okay, how do I improve the world that I'm in? Critical theory goes with the assumption that something's wrong in society. It builds a moral framework and it says this is how everything should be. So now we're going to tear apart the civilization society as it is and we're going to rebuild it. So hopefully it more matches our moral prescription. We're going to talk about what that is in just a second with the idea of power dynamics, but let's finish out this paragraph. This use of the word critical is drawn from Marx's insistence that everything be ruthlessly criticized, and from his admonition that the point of studying society is to change it. It's a very important line. The point of studying society is to change it. That's the cultural Marxist idea. That's Marx's theory. You don't study society to understand it and then improve it. You understand society to change it in fundamental ways. Of note, then, a critical theory is not only tangentially concerned with understanding or truth and has, as Hume might have it, abandoned descriptions of what it is in favor of pushing for what the particular critical theory holds ought to be. The critical methodology, then, is the central object of concern, and it is the tool by which social justice, scholarship, and activism proceed. Remember that, it's a tool. Let's go to this real fast. So in this, he basically summarizes what James Lindsay summarizes what he just said. A critical theories do this. They propose a moral vision for society. A critical theory then ruthlessly, following Marx, criticizes society and especially social systems and institutions for failing to live up to that vision. It's not just on a system level. It's everything, as we'll talk about in just a second. It motivates activism on behalf of identity, disrupting, dismantling, subverting, and deconstructing the system that produces those problematics, etc., which also tends to see as ordinary and permanent, thus unflexible from within the system. So that's a critical theory, and it says that's the way it works. So this paragraph right here is the last one I'll say from James Lindsay at this point. In general, theory, that's theory of capital T critical, is a non-scientific approach to studying the ways in that systemic power, it's very important, systemic power exists and operates in society. That is, theory is a particular kind of study of justice and injustice, as those are shaped by typically vague, sometimes paranoid, usually cynical forces in society that maintain the dynamics of dominance and oppression, typically by factors of identity. Theory's concern is identifying these power dynamics, exposing them, and finding ways to change or overthrow them. In this sense, theory explicitly sees everything as being political, even intellectual rejection or emotional reactions to its bullying methods. Okay, so let's stop there. Now, here's what I'm going to say about critical theory. In Christianity, we have a simple way of understanding reality. We understand Christ is God, and I've pulled up Colossians 1 here. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. In Christianity, we understand that all things were created by Christ, through him, by God. That everything that was made has a purpose, and that is for him. It belongs to him. It's all meant to glorify him, to rebound to his glory and work for his purposes, so that he might have his elect church, that he might be the head of his body, his bride, his church, whom he loves, who he gave himself up for. And so the Christian version of reality, just to summarize, and by the way, all things are going back to him. Everything's going to return to him, so to speak. But the Christian model of reality is that all things hold together in Christ. Nothing's outside of his authority. Matthew 28, the little bit of Jesus says right before the Great Commission that we often forget to quote, but he says, all authority in heaven and on earth is given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. All authority is in Christ's hands. And so when a Christian seeks to understand reality, a Christian doesn't see it through the lens of an overarching it's not through the lens that there are power dynamics that infiltrate everything in society, from systems to relationships between people. That's not at all the way in which Christians view reality. Yes, there's sin, there's injustice, there's all these things, but it's not based on this presupposition that power is inherently immoral, and that because there's power, there are inherently people who are oppressed because they don't have power, and there are oppressors who are morally evil because they do have power. And so it's in Christianity, it's not as clear as it is with Marxism, if you want to put it that way. Marxism isn't clear, and Christianity is. Marxism says if you're rich, you're evil, you're part of the oppressor class, and if you are not rich, you are part of the oppressed class by nature. That is what you are. And this infiltrates really everything. And I'll read this from Tyson, what's her face? It's an introduction to critical theory, and she's a writer. Lewis Tyson, I think it is, or Lois Tyson. That's her name. And so she says this, writing about the the Marxist approach as a critical methodology. She says this: of course, there are many more capitalist ideologies we could analyze. These few are intended just to illustrate, in general terms, the Marxist view of repressive ideologies. Our goal as Marxist critiques is to identify the ideology at work in cultural productions, literature, films, paintings, music, television programs, commercial advertisements, education, popular philosophy, religion, forms of entertainment, and so on, and to analyze how that ideology supports or undermines the socio-economic system, the power structure, in which that cultural production plays a significant role. So it's everything. It is in all things, whether art, music, film, theater, literature, and television, or just people talking on a normal day. And this is the view of critical theory. Critical theory says all things hold together through power dynamics. All things are based on power, and that is antithetical, as I think we can see from Colossians 1 to the Christian belief. And Marx, of course, was not a Christian and very much opposed to the Christian, the God of the Bible. We'll just leave it at that. So without further ado, I've spent too long on this. Let's get into Carl Trueman's critical race theory. Carl Trueman, I have mixed feelings about him. He's a guy I don't rightly understand. He's far more scholastic than suits my tastes. Yet he says things, even in this article, he says things that are seemingly contradictory to his overall position. I'll get to some of that. But he seems too academic, too scholastic, and he'll say things against critical race theory, of course, and others. But then he'll be in support of critical theory more broadly and seem to imply that, well, as we'll see, that Marx and other critical theorists were onto something, and we can learn from them. Okay, so let's read this first paragraph again and go on. As debates over critical race theory rage on, both in society and within the church, one important point seems to have been missed by all sides. Many of the most important biblical writers were among the sharpest critical theorists of their day. Now, this is true. Critical race theory rages on, both in society and within the church. That's true. This is what we're facing is a culture war, and it's grounded largely in critical theory, which I agree with. However, I disagree with the fact that he places the debates squarely on critical race theory's shoulders. I believe it has to do with far more than that, and I believe it has to do with critical theory in and of itself as a thought system, as a logic by which we understand reality. In Christianity, we're supposed to take every thought captive to Christ. We are supposed to understand reality through Christ. That's how we're supposed to understand reality, and critical theory is subversive to that. Critical theory doesn't just replace doctrines. It's not Roman Catholicism where it takes away this doctrine and implements this doctrine. It's not a cult where it takes away the divinity of Christ and then says that Christ is just a prophet, or like Islam does. It's more sinister than that, I think. It's a thing that says we're just going to replace Christ altogether. We're going to replace God altogether as the one who defines reality. It's incredibly dangerous. But his theory, his thesis for the paper, I guess, is that many of the most important biblical writers were among the sharpest critical theorists of their day. That's what he's going to try to prove, and I hope to prove that he's wrong. First of all, and this is just the simplest point I can make on this, is that critical theory wasn't in existence until 1930s era. And so there were forms of it before, sure. You can go back into Hegelian dialectic, step back further than that, and you can go into the Hermetic religions of ancient times. And you can go to all these things and you can say, well, there are forms of critical theory before then. But a philosopher shouldn't import. They shouldn't take terms that we have today and apply them to figures that lived long ago. When we don't know when these terms are new in their natural meaning. Now, of course, that's the easiest argument to make. It's generally unwise to do that, but we'll see if he makes his case enough to where that contention is dissolved. All right. Quoting again, second sentence of the first paragraph. I might be naive to imagine that an appreciation of the theological resources available to those who wish to hone their analysis of society might move the current discussions forward. Okay, this is interesting. So he's saying that there's a great resource that's largely untapped from those who wish to hone their analysis of society. So he's saying that we need to move the discussion forward. We need to progress towards another higher kind of analysis of society. Given that so many presume that race, class, gender, sexual identity, and the rest exhaust our critical tools. Now this is interesting because he's basically saying that critical race theory, critical class theory, critical or queer theory, I guess you could say, all of these things, that they are critical tools for us understand reality, critical feminist theory. Just put anything between the words critical and theory, and it's a form of critical theory. And people use it as a critical tool to understand society and how it functions. And again, it's based on the idea that everything is held together through power dynamics. So the assumption in race is that the white hegemonic power, anybody who's white is involved in that, and they're automatically the oppressor, and anybody who is black is automatically the oppressed. And that is categorically antithetical to what the Bible teaches. We'll get into that later. It's hard to not jump the gun on this, because I think he just says some things that are just absolutely ludicrous. Last sentence of that first paragraph. But Christians at least should acknowledge Isaiah and Paul as more fruitful interlocutors than Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. Crenshaw, of course, mapping the margins, devoted so much to intersectionality. She's the mother of intersectionality, some people might say, of that movement. Let's go and examine this idea that Isaiah and Paul were more fruitful in their analysis of society as critical theorists. That's basically what he's saying. Isaiah never read the German ideology of Marx and Engels. Well, yeah, that's true. I'm glad you said that, because I was concerned that you were saying that Isaiah and Paul, if we asked them, hey, are you critical theorists, they would have said yes, of course. Yeah, we totally agree with Marx. Second sentence. Yet he had a clear grasp of how falsehood can supplant truth and lead to the perversion of a culture. Okay, I have yet highlighted in red, and I mean it. What do you mean that yet? Despite the fact that he didn't have Marx and Engels, the founders of communism, that he had a grasp of how falsehood could supplant truth and lead to the perversion of culture. How do I even talk about this? Oh goodness. But you could say, well, yet, he's not saying that it's good that Marx and Engels, Marx and Engels, maybe all that Carl Trueman is saying is that they had a grasp, but it was insufficient, and it wasn't, it was founded on power dynamics, and Isaiah's wasn't. He had a clearer grasp of how falsehood can supplant the truth and lead to the perversion of a culture. Except that the sentence doesn't end there. He continues, a perversion that alienates men and women from themselves, from nature, and from reality. If you know anything about Marxist critical theory, critical social justice, you'll understand that this goes to the heart of what that is. And I'm just going to, where's my mouse? I'm going to go over here to this again, and I'm just going to use this. James Lindsay commenting on this again. He's going to quote from Marx and then summarize him. I think this is useful. I'll start right up here. Power in the world of man is not equal, however, thus neither is the capacity to create society and through it to create man, which is the Marxist ideal. You're creating man through society, which is kind of like a second person of the Trinity idea in Marxism. And James Lindsay talks about this in a thing called The Theology of Marxism. It's a 3-hour podcast, very worth listening to, though. There's a division of labor, quote, there's a division of labor which, like the fall in Genesis, has estranged man from one another and, in fact, from himself. As Marx wrote in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, communism is the answer to man's estrangement from himself. Estrangement from himself. Carl Trueman, quote, alienates, a perversion that alienates men and women from themselves, from nature, and from reality. Marx, communism as the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement, and therefore as the real appropriation of the human essence by and for man. Communism, therefore, as the complete return of man to himself as a social, i.e. human being, a return accomplished consciously and embraced embracing the entire wealth of previous development. This communism, as fully developed naturalism, equals humanism, and as fully developed humanism equals naturalism. As a dialectic for you. Picking back up on quote, sorry, I shouldn't interrupt. When quoting Marx, he's hard enough to understand. Quote, it is the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature, and between man and man. The true resolution of the strife between existence and essence, between objectification and self-confirmation, between freedom and necessity, between the individual and the species. Communism is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be the solution. All right, okay. Shush. Hard to understand, but here's James Lindsay's synopsis. Because man is man, capital M, is estranged from himself. And so Marx had this idea that man in the garden, in his original state, was one with nature. He knew he had a oneness about it. And man is estranged from himself and from others now by the existence of private property. Man was one with everybody else. Man was one with nature and one with mankind. And he didn't care about private property or individualism or anything else. And now he does, and he's estranged from himself. And communism is trying to undo that mistake and get them back to the garden, i.e. one with nature and one with man. And because man is estranged from himself and from others by the existence of private property, power is unequal. He is forced to live in an alienated state, in an alien world in which the power dynamics that maintain private property prevent him not only from his birthright in the garden, where no one works, birthright is not working, but also from knowing himself as a perfectly social being, which is as someone entitled to be there in Eden on his own terms. Thus, strange as it sounds, by maintaining his belief in private property, man, capital M, condemns himself to toil and death so that the original sin of owning things as individuals can be maintained. That's Marx's vision of the fall. And that's his critique, okay? So when we talk about Marx and Engels and all these guys, and I'll talk about this later on in other podcasts and blog posts, especially when I get to Christopher Watkin. I can't wait for that. In his book, Biblical Critical Theory, one of the most dangerous books ever written in the past decade or longer for the Christian church. Biblical Critical Theory by Christopher Watkin. I really, truly believe that. When we talk about Marx, it's not simply that he has this idea, he's invented this tool by which we can understand social dynamics and social reality. It's a different religion. And people don't understand that, and it's not simply understanding reality. It's saying this is the way reality works, and this is how we must understand it and must change it. And it has nothing to do with Christ. It's detached from reality, and it is a religion. It's a cult, and we need to be wary of it. And it's not just that there are, it's like people have this idea that Marxism, there are things in Marxism that we can't accept, but Marx essentially agrees with a Christian kind of position, and that's ridiculous. From fundamentally, he's different. Okay, I should go back to this. So, Carl Trueman, a perversion that alienates men and women from themselves, from nature, and from reality. Now, he may not put this in economic terms, but what else does he mean? Is he saying that man is estranged from man and women from themselves, from nature, and from reality in the same way Marx is? Because if so, we've got a massive problem. Isaiah's complaint, quote from Carl Trueman, second paragraph. Isaiah's complaint echoes through his prophecy. Israel had created, we might say socially constructed. Okay, we might say socially constructed, but Isaiah didn't. Isaiah did not say socially constructed. Israel had created, we might say socially constructed, gods to replace the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These social constructions were given material form as idols, and Israelite society, history, and cultic life were reconfigured around their purported power. Isaiah's divine commission was to expose idolatry as a system of falsehoods. Not just deceptions about the true nature of God, but also lies about who should dominate. Who should dominate? Interesting. And this is Carl Trueman's understanding of Isaiah in Isaiah's ministry, Isaiah's priestly ministry, what Isaiah was about as a prophet, to expose not just the deceptions about the true nature of God, but also lies about who should dominate. What in the world does that mean? Injustices flourish when men's worship is perverted. Moreover, the consciousness of people was so seared by their wickedness that God told Isaiah at the outset that they would be blind and deaf to his critique of their culture. One might rightly say that Israel was captive to systemic idolatry. Well, again, I don't think Isaiah would have put it in those terms. And if you mean systemic idolatry, as in systemic power, as in Marxist critical theory, we got a big old problem. Okay, so let's go back up here to this point. Israel had created, we might say, socially constructed gods to replace the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These social constructs were given material form as idols, and Israel's society, history, and cultic life were reconfigured around their purported power. Idolatry as a system of falsehoods, and Isaiah's point is to critique their culture. Now, I'll go through this real fast, and I'll go to another passage. No, it's not a critique. I'm quoting myself here when I made these notes a week ago or so. It is a denunciation, a condemnation. And the people's blindness and deafness, if Trueman is referring to Isaiah 6, Isaiah's call to the ministry, is not about the people not being able to see or hear because of their because it's a cultural system based around power. It's about God's judgment. So just quote here from Isaiah 6:10 through 12. Make the heart, and this is God sending Isaiah out on his ministry. Quote, make the heart of this people dull and their eyes heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. Then I said, how long, O Lord? And he said, until the cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is desolate, and the Lord removes people far away, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. Okay, so you can judge for yourself based on that passage if I'm right or not. The idea of critique of their culture, again, that's a Marxist term, and I'm sorry, Tim Keller used that term all the time. I read a lot from him right now, and he says all the time it's the critique of culture. We need to understand where we can affirm and critique culture, and it's this critical theorist idea that you're critiquing, you're deconstructing, you're finding things in the culture that doesn't match your moral framework, that's based on power dynamics, that there's an inequality there, and you're critiquing it. The consciousness of the people was so seared by their wickedness that God told Isaiah at the outset that they would be blind and deaf. And again, I say that yes, but those two things go along with judgment. It's not merely as a critique of their culture. It's a judgment against their culture. It's a judgment against sinners. And we're going to talk about that more when we get to Isaiah 44. I should remember when I'm going to... Yeah, here it is. So let's just move on. In chapter 44, quote from Carl Trueman's third paragraph. In chapter 44, Isaiah describes a man who cuts down a tree and uses half of it to make fire, to cook dinner, while fashioning the other half into a god, which he then worships. The critique is powerful. Well, yeah, but not for the reasons you think, Dr. Trueman. The prophet uses the man's actions in order to expose the absurdity of his idolatrous behavior. Rather, I don't understand why that rather is there. It doesn't make sense. I think it's a typo of sorts, but you can figure out if you think it has meaning beyond a typo. Rather, as later critical, the prophet uses the man's actions in order to expose the absurdity of his idolatrous behavior. Rather, as later critical theorists might point to the conflict between Jefferson's proclamation of natural light and the Declaration of Independence, and his ownership of slaves, Isaiah here lays bare the internal contradictions of Israelite idolatry, mocking the self-deceptions, as Marx would millennia later when commenting on the ideological mystifications of class domination. Man, what do you even say? Okay, let's just internal contradictions. Let's go after that one first. Let me make sure I've got the right notes. Give me a second. Okay, yes, I do have everything I need. I can't pull it up on the screen, but I can read from it. It's from Moitcher's commentary on Isaiah, and I'm just gonna. It's hard when you're coming at this because he's not making an exposition of the actual passage. He's not going to the passage and saying verse by verse, okay, let me make the case that these comparisons are true, and that my interpretation of the passage is correct. He's not doing that, and so it makes it incredibly hard. But I'm going to read Moitcher's commentary on Isaiah 44, and I'll largely let you to think through. I don't know if I'll quote much on it. It's a tricky thing to comment on. But Isaiah 44. This is Moitcher's summary of verses 9 through 20. The message of verses 6 through 8. Quote, the message of verses 6 through 8. That there is one incomparable God is justified by a searching examination of idolatry. Isaiah 9, verse 9, sets out a basic proposition that idolatry makes no sense, brings no profit, and can be commended only on the basis of blind ignorance. With this later point, verses 18 through 20 form an inclusio. Idolaters are ignorant and blind. Idolatry is logically indefensible. But at a deeper level, this dead, meaningless, profitless thing grips the idolater in a hold that he cannot break. Between these brackets, the argument has two main thrusts. The idol cannot rise above its human origin, verses 10 through 13, nor above its material basis, verses 14 through 17. Isaiah both acknowledges and refuses to acknowledge any invisible spiritual reality of which the idol is an outward symbol. On the other hand, there is nothing in idolatry but the artifact. The heathen, in his blindness, bows down to wood and stone, or as the Roman poet Horace put it, once I used to be an oak tree, a craftsman, however, preferred I should be a god. Paul would concur. We know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one, 1 Corinthians 8:4. For the apostle, as for the prophet, an unambiguous monotheism determined the question. There is nothing behind the visible idol because there is only one God. But, on the other hand, the idol holds the idolater in an iron grip from which he cannot save himself. And to this Paul also would assent. In the same passage, that indeed there are many gods and many lords, 1 Corinthians 8:5, and at the deepest, most awful level, that the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God, 1 Corinthians 10:20. The meaningless and dead idol has a grim power to make its devotees become like itself. Psalm 115 verse 8. Okay, so again, that's a solid commentary. I appreciated that this year, or last year as well. I quoted from it extensively in my exposition of Isaiah 7 on my blog post titled "The Manual." So you can read that if you wish. But let's get back to Carl Trueman's position here and read what he's saying. Isaiah describes a man who cuts down a tree and uses half of it to make a fire to cook dinner while fashioning the other half into a god which he then worships. The critique is powerful. The prophet uses the man's actions in order to expose the absurdity of his idolatrous behavior. Isaiah here lays bare the internal contradictions of Israelite idolatry. I don't know what he means by the internal contradictions. It's absurd. It's meaningless. It's profitless. It's all of these things. What does he mean by the internal contradictions of Israelite idolatry? He mocks the self-deceptions as Marx would millennia later when commenting on the ideological mystifications of class domination. Okay, so let's focus on that last bit, mocking the self-deceptions as Marx would. Marx didn't mock self-deceptions, and that's what Isaiah is doing. Isaiah is not going, oh, look at the culture, look at the culture set this up the system, and the poor people are all being oppressed, and they're in this they're under this repressive ideology. This ideology that acts like it's not an ideology, but people are stuck in it. And Trueman's saying that, well, that's exactly what Isaiah's doing, and no, it's not. It's not. That's not Isaiah's point at all. There is no God like I am. There is no rock, I know not of any. Who's a God besides me? God says in Isaiah 44, verse 8. And you get down here, all who fashion idols are nothing, and the things they delight in do not profit. Their witness is neither see nor know, that they may be put to shame. Who fashions a god or casts an idol that is profitable for nothing? Behold, all his companions shall be put to shame, and the craftsmen are only human. Let them assemble, let them stand forth. They shall be terrified. They shall be put to shame together. But it's individualistic. It's not the idea that Marx was right in this idea that there's systemic power structures, and that's the correct way of analyzing society, is ridiculous on that passage. Isaiah knows nothing of that, and it seems like Carl Trueman is reading that back in to what he's saying. Millennia later, when commenting on the ideological mystifications of class domination, what's the class domination here in Isaiah 44? Where is it? Point it out to me, please. That's nowhere here. Again, Moitier in his comments on Isaiah 44, verse 20. Sorry, I got some background static. I hope that's not coming through. Here's what he says in a good commentary on Isaiah 44, verse 20. The idolater is hooked on idolatry. A whole area of freedom has died, and he is not able to save himself. First, there is his own chosen actions. Feeds on ashes. Ashes looks back to verses 15, 16, 17, where wood is reduced to its substantial reality. What is it but ashes? The idol may impress, but it is in reality no more than the substitute, the dead embers. Secondly, there is the inner consequence of this choice, deluded. The idolater chose a delusion and became deluded. Quoting from Psalm 115, verse 8. Who is the agent behind this induced delusion? Is it the Lord acting in providential laws and judgment? He has instituted that a false choice begets a false person. Is it the idol, the delusion, producing its own likeness? Thirdly, there is an ensuing state of bondage, cannot save. And then right hand, the idolater picks up the figurine in his hand, holding it, but in reality it holds him. He is in bondage to a lie. And so you have both things. Because sin begets sin, the idolater is entrapped in his own sin, not the sins of others. Ezekiel 18 makes clear that yes, generational sin is a reality. But if the son says no to his father's sin and walks in a different way, then he will save. He will be upright. Basically, we'll put it that way, for sake of simplicity. If a father is doing the right thing and the son decides to go off and sin, again describing the generational thing, a cultural thing. If the son decides to go off and sin, then he'll bear the consequences for his own sin. He won't. But again, if the father's sinning and then the son doesn't follow, the son's not going to bear the consequences for his father's sin. That's the biblical view. It has nothing to do with this critical theorist idea of the different power dynamics and the cultural ideologies, the repressive ideologies that captivate people. It involves people, individuals choosing for themselves to exchange the glory of the immortal God for glory of created things. I hope that made sense. I spent longer on that than I wanted to. But there you go. I'm going to try and get through this today in this podcast, but I'm losing steam. All right, let's read the next paragraph. The Apostle Paul continues in the Old Testament's critical tradition. Oy vey. He spent one paragraph trying to establish that Isaiah has a critical tradition or a critical methodology, and then he makes that statement. Unbelievable. In Romans 1, he points to the fact that fallen man has perverted his religious instinct and its natural orientation to worship of the true God. This perversion occurs because we fabricate idols. Yes, we fabricate idols in our own sin. By venerating them, we direct our attention away from God, the Creator. Instead of looking upward, idolatrous man looks downward and is bewitched and enslaved to the world's lusts. Paul recounts the disastrous consequences, the abandonment of natural sexual relations between men and women, and then all manner of wickedness, from envy to actual murder. Our moral depravity and social dysfunctions arise from a fundamental rejection of the truth of God in favor of the lies of idols. Okay. The order of this is completely messed up. That is not Paul's argument whatsoever. Let's just read one verse in Romans 1. Verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. They do this by exchanging God for created things, worshiping the creation rather than the Creator. Carl Trueman's assessment of Romans 1, our moral depravity and social dysfunctions arise from a fundamental rejection of the truth of God in favor of the lies of idols. No, that's not at all what Paul said. Our moral depravity doesn't... Let's see what I've got here. No, our idol making arises out of our moral depravity. That is Paul's point here, and that is Paul's point elsewhere. This is his point all the way through. The problem is not human systems, but the human heart. And let's just pull up that passage from 2 Thessalonians 2, 10 through 12. And with all wicked, so he's describing the coming of the lost one is like the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders. Verse 10, and with all wicked deceptions for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore God sends them a strong delusion, so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. The pleasure of unrighteousness and not believing the truth go hand in hand. It's not that we have systems of idolatry and then that explains our moral depravity. That has it completely backwards. I don't understand how you can write that sentence after looking at Paul. You have to be captivated by critical theory to think in that term. Again, our moral depravity and social dysfunctions arise from a fundamental rejection of the truth of God in favor of the lies of idols. No, idolatry arises out of a rejection of the truth and a pleasure in unrighteousness. That's the biblical explanation. Next paragraph. The cultural criticism offered by Isaiah and Paul has two key elements. First, although the criticism shows the perversions of what we call systems or culturally constructed patterns of behavior. What the Bible calls that's sin. Read Ezekiel 18 again. It brings into focus our culpability. Yet, yes, the Israelites of Isaiah's day were embedded in systemic idolatry. Again, it's a Marxist term, systemic idolatry, that's founded on the idea of Marxist cultural Marxism. That you have these different systems of power, and everything's power dynamics, and it's not the Christian view, as we said at the beginning. Quote, as were the people of Paul's day, and our own day as well. But this social conditioning does not exculpate. It does not prove innocence. Just put it that way. We are idolaters because we want to be. Trueman, I don't understand. Why? It seems like you're walking on a tightrope in which you're trying to say two different contradictory things. At one point, you say our moral depravity and social dysfunctions arise from a fundamental rejection of the truth in favor of the lies of idols, i.e., these systems, these culturally constructed patterns of behavior, systemic idolatry. And yet you say, but we are idolaters because we want to be, which is true. So why did you go through everything that you just went through? Quote, we are not hapless tools of a system that dominates our individual agency and thus absolves us of any responsibility. Well, that's not Marx's position. That's not Engels' position. That's not any of the people who hold to these, quote, critical tools think. They don't believe that. Critical theory, by definition, does not believe this. Under critical theory, many are hapless tools, or worse, they're complicit in the power systems, the power dynamics. But the real evil is power. It's not sin in critical theory. Isaiah, quote, Isaiah notes the zeal with which Israel embraces idolatry. Paul links the lust of sexual sin to panting after idols. We want to reject God and create our own gods. Yeah, that's the biblical definition of sin. Just stop there, please. Just stop right there. Go back. Just focus on that. It doesn't. Thus, the biblical critique is not only cultural, but also spiritual. Here it is, folks. Biblical critical theory, spiritual critical theory, whatever you want to call it, Christian critical theory. Good night. Yeah. It convicts idolaters, quote, it convicts idolaters of their personal responsibility for the system within which they operate. A system within which they happily live, even as it contradicts the moral structure of the world God created. Carl Trueman, do you need idolaters to have a systemic culture of idolatry? I think that's a valid question. Because the scriptural mode of critique focuses on culpability, the second key element follows repentance and forgiveness. Isaiah and Paul are aiming to dismantle idolatry as a social system in the way so many call for activism on behalf of social justice. Let me just say that again. Isaiah and Paul are aiming to dismantle idolatry as a social system in the way so many call for activism on behalf of social justice. That is a ridiculous statement. Quote, they are calling for idolaters to turn from their idolatry and seek forgiveness from God. Forgiveness that will not be withheld because the God of Israel is a merciful God. The God of critical theory is not merciful. Quote, again and again, Isaiah calls the people to turn in repentance from their false gods, a perverted worship that causes the grave injustices he recounts. Again, you haven't described those injustices, you just said that they're there. Isaiah's focus is on the people of Israel's relationship with God. Yes, that has real implications for the rest of society and the messed up nature of Israel, but it stems from their relationship with God, and that is the focus of Isaiah. What do you mean by what you have said above already? Where is it? Not just deceptions about the true nature of God, but also lies about who should dominate. What do you mean? And thus, biblical critique is not only cultural, but also spiritual. We already read that. Sorry, it's down here. If Israel will return to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then peace and justice have a chance. What? Just let peace and justice have a chance, man. No, I'm sorry, that's not the point of Isaiah. The point of Isaiah is, look, you're going through judgment for sin. You will go through judgment for sin. Return to God and He'll have compassion on you. He'll abundantly pardon. Isaiah 55, verses 6 through 9. Seek the Lord while He may be found. Call upon Him while He is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, that He may have compassion on him, and to our God, for He will abundantly pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Read Isaiah 65 as well, and you'll have a good grasp of what the import of Isaiah is. If Israel will return to God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then peace and justice have a chance. It's not the message of Isaiah. Is it true? If that sentence was alone, outside of the context of what he's already written, yeah. Inside, no, because peace and justice in the critical justice lens is not the peace and justice that the Bible talks about. Paul's purpose, quote, is the same. He seeks to convict his readers of the dead end of worldliness that flows from worshiping graven images, bondage to sin and death, so that they will return in repentance and faith to Jesus Christ. In other words, biblical critical theory does not end in critique. It aims at transformation through grace. Well, guess what? None of the other critical theories end with critique. The other critical theories have an objective, they have an agenda, and it's to destroy the nuclear family and subvert it and put something in its place that is ugly and hideous. And I have no assurance whatsoever that biblical critical theory intends to do anything else. It aims at transformation through grace. Alright, let's go to the end of this section. 2 more paragraphs. Secular critical theory ranges from old-fashioned Marxist critical theory based on economic factors to feminist and gay theories of forms of false consciousness that entail repressive social mores. Again, man, you don't even need to comment on that at this point. I've covered that enough. In one way or another, modern critical theory focuses on social construction and the manipulative nature of the dominant narratives cultures tell themselves. The results are not unlike the critiques of idolatry that Isaiah and Paul advance. Modern critical theory focuses on social construction and the manipulative nature of the dominant narratives cultures tell themselves. Okay, they are cultural narratives. Marx, even just the passage that we read, well, we didn't read it actually, I read it beforehand. Marx understands that what he's saying is an ideology. He openly admitted that. He's just said, all the other ideologies are repressive, and mine is the only one that wants to liberate. And it's not like the other ones. It is fundamentally contradictory to Christianity. They are unlike the critiques of idolatry that Isaiah and Paul advance, because Isaiah and Paul are saying this is the judgment of God on you. You are deceived in your own sin. So it's not, quote, so it's not surprising that Christians are attracted to critical theory. Well, that's another thing. I'll have some things to say on why some people think that Christians are attracted to critical theory, and why I think there are Christians falling for critical theory and some other time, but not now. I've already made this long enough. Like the Bible's prophetic tradition, it refuses to take the world at face value and seeks to unmask the discourses of power that structure social relations. What more do you need? He is on board with critical theory, 100%. Furthermore, the purpose of secular critical theories, which is not merely to expose the world's ideological captivity, but to effect its transformation, resonates with what Isaiah and Paul are doing. The purpose of secular critical theories resonates with what Isaiah and Paul are doing. But what are they doing? To expose the world's ideological captivity, not only to do that, but to effect its transformation. On a surface level, on the shallowest level ever, yeah, that's true. You're captive to the spirit of the age. You're captive to the devil and to the thought systems that he's created in the world, and Christ comes to transform, to save you out of there, to save you from death to life, to make you alive with God, so that you walk in him, newness of life. Go read Ephesians 2. Get that in your head before you read this junk. Because otherwise you won't see it. It'll look like it's great. It'll look like it's Christian, but it's not. It's not what Isaiah and Paul are doing. It's fundamentally different. On a surface level, it's the same, but fundamentally, deep down, it's different. And until you see that, you won't see how it's different in practice. Okay, last paragraph, quote, "But we do well to remember John Henry Newman's observation on the nature of heresy. It seizes on one aspect of the truth and presses it at the expense of all others. Secular critical theory is not made necessarily incompatible with Christianity by the substance of its affirmations, although it may be incompatible in respect to some." Sorry, I didn't say that very well, but let's just keep going. "Taken as a whole, the critical turn in modernity is incompatible with Christianity because it takes a part of the truth and presents it as the whole truth. By advancing a comprehensive theory based on partial truths, it ends up opposing the truth." Okay, we're going to get into that in the rest of this article, but I don't even know if I'm going to continue it. You can read it on First Things. As I said, I've asked other people who are smarter and wiser than me to address this. They haven't. There's like one review online that I found, and it's not super great. It's written by a layman, I think. But nobody else has, and so I've done this far. You can read on your own and determine what you think. I don't know if it's useful for me to keep going through this, or how much I can bear up with this. But my question is, well, why have you said everything that you've said so far? Because you've essentially said we can take parts of this, we can use them as tools. These are our critical tools. So what gives? What's the deal? I don't get it. I don't get it at all. It takes part of the truth, presents it as the whole truth. By advancing a comprehensive theory based on partial truths, it ends up opposing the truth. You can read the rest of it again, decide if you think that Carl Trueman is right or wrong in his assessment. I can't tell you enough how much it irks me that critical theory is such a thing in these circles. It's absolutely disparaging, depressing. It's not great. And I need to go. I have people to see. Problems cause, as Rodney Rathbone says in Adventures in Odyssey, people to see, problems to cause, and people to beat up. A quote from Rodney Rathbone in Adventures in Odyssey. I hope this was somewhat useful. I didn't get to everything that I wanted to say, didn't say it in the best way, but honestly, I hope I don't need to make a much better case than what I have against this. My advice to you is to learn what critical theory is and to learn how to recognize it and why it's wrong to put forward in Christian circles, because it is. And it is the greatest threat we've faced since the Reformation, in my humblest of opinions. And things like this don't help. Don't fall for biblical critical theory or critical grace theory. Stand for Scripture as it is. All things hold together in Christ. Okay, I'm done. Bye for now.